Welcome to Engaging the Supernatural, where we explore what God is saying to us today through signs, wonders, and miracles. I'm excited to have my friend John Burke back for a part two interview. He has a best selling book called Imagine Heaven, and we couldn't get into everything we wanted to get into last time, so we brought him back for a second conversation. John, welcome back to the show.
Oh, thanks for trying again with me.
Yes, we'll end somewhere good. It'll be fantastic. I think the place I'd love to start this conversation is just talking a little bit about, and since you have an engineering background, kind of the mechanics. Like, walk us through what it's like when somebody leaves their body. Last time we spoke, we talked a little bit about people all of a sudden, they clinically die and they're like, man, I feel great. Something shifted. They see their body. A lot of times they don't recognize that it's them initially. But just walk us through kind of what are the typical mechanics of somebody leaving their body and transitioning kind of to the other side of the veil. What does that look like for a lot of the near death experiencers, as you call them?
Yeah, so the commonalities would and by the way, it's unique for every
Right.
person. It's one of the things I've realized is that God knows us uniquely and tailors it uniquely as well. But commonly, a person will leave their body. Maybe their heart stopped beating; it was a cardiac arrest, or they're in the ER. They can see what's going on in the room, which, as we talked about in the first episode, for me as an engineer is what convinced me this is real because there's so much evidence that they were actually able to see things that they couldn't otherwise have unless this was really happening. Um, Many times then they will travel. Some say it was like a tunnel opened up, and some say it's a black tunnel, like where there's no light or color. Some, on the other hand, it's a light tunnel. Um, and as they go through, and sometimes it is it's a pathway through like the heavens, through the stars. It's which was shocking to me because I wouldn't have thought that would be the way it was. So it's not always the same, but oftentimes as they travel through this tunnel, they're also aware. Some are aware of voices beckoning them to the side or wanting to come. And even like I think about a story I just interviewed from a Jewish woman in Australia who died in a car accident. And she said as she was going through this tunnel, she heard voices trying to get her to come to the side, and that frightened her. But there was a brilliant light ahead. That's common. And they come, and this light becomes brighter and brighter, and then they find themselves in this new world. And it's not unlike our world in the sense of, I mean, I think many who I've interviewed have said that paradise, angels have told them paradise is actually the countryside outside the city of God, the New Jerusalem, and it's vast. I mean, far more vast than our Earth, but it's not unlike our Earth, and it helps us in transition. There are meadows and valleys and mountains and hills and flowers and trees of species we have here on Earth, but way far beyond as well. And then they are greeted by a welcoming committee, many times of their relatives who have gone before them, uh, people that they loved and knew in the life to come. And they come, and it's a great reunion. It's this huge reunion. Like you recognize each other. We have our memories. There are hugs, but the hugs are deeper than they've ever been before. And they say you communicate, but you can use your mouth, but you don't have to.
It's like thought to thought.
It's thought to thought. Some call it telepathy, but really it's more than that. It's heart to heart.
Right.
It's thoughts, it's feelings, it's everything needed to completely understand each other, and it's instantaneous. And so they have this great reunion with people, and then many times that is when then they see this brilliant God of light and love. Those who know Jesus know he's Jesus. Jesus said, "My sheep hear my voice and they know me." To some, Jesus appears like you would think Jesus would look when he was on earth. Other times, he is this brilliant light, brighter than the sun. But of course, Jesus said, "I am the light of the world," right?
In terms of like tailoring the experience to what's going to be special or unique for that individual, I've been amazed in terms of some of the descriptions of God the Father. Sometimes people will talk about the Father taking them onto His lap like they're a little child and just holding them. I've had other people talk about they have like an intense throne room encounter where God's just in majesty and there's like the fullness of His glory, and so there are similarities, but at the same time, there are no two experiences that are quite the same. It's often very tailored to that individual.
Well, and sometimes I'm kind of shocked at Christians who just kind of push this away. And they say things like, well, Jesus is seated at the right hand of the throne of God, so they couldn't have seen Jesus on earth in their near death experience. And I'm like, have you read the Bible? Like, Jesus showed up to the disciples resurrected over 500. He can and he sustains everything. And he said in John 15, I'm always with you. Right. So to your point, one of the most fascinating stories after I wrote Imagine Heaven was Heidi. So I was on the news in New York City. She's a nurse, and she saw me on the news and emailed me, and she said, "I don't know who you are. I've never read your book, but that happened to me when I was 16, when my horse fell on me and crushed me." And I grew up Jewish in an atheist agnostic home, but Jesus was there with me. I've never told anyone that. Thanks. That was her email. I'm
Have a
like,
nice day.
what the heck? And so I reached out to her and we started a friendship. And I was able to show her in the Jewish prophets how this Jesus Messiah is your Messiah. It's here for thousands of years in the Jewish prophets. And she got baptized for faith in Jesus. She'd always believed in Jesus since she was 16. But the thing that was so cool to me just showed the personality of God and just how much God gets us. So when she was 16, her horse rears back, falls on her, crushes her. She's up 30 feet above, looking down, thinking, oh, I wish my sisters didn't have to watch me die. But she feels great. And then she sees a brilliant light over her right shoulder. She turns, and there is Jesus. And he looked like Jesus, and she knew he was Jesus. And she said, but it wasn't like I was surprised. So I'm not like, what's a good Jewish girl like me doing with a rabbi like you, like, because that's not kosher.
Sounds like a weird country song.
Yeah, exactly. But she said, I knew he was God, and he was the God I had always prayed to. And Jesus gives her a life review. And in the life review, she sees as she's praying at night, because she grew up in a really tough, difficult environment. And she would go at 8 years old into her room and pray, and she would have incredible peace and comfort. And she saw as she was praying, it was Jesus sitting on the bed beside her, comforting her. Isn't that amazing?
That is amazing.
And so in this experience, then after Jesus gives her this life review, now remember, she's a 16-year-old girl, right? And he looks at her and with this big grin, and he grabs her hand and they take off. And she said they took off through, it was like outer space. She didn't know, but she said we were surfing a wave of light. So it was like surfing. And she said, I could feel the energy on my bare feet, because we both had bare feet, but we were going as fast as, I don't know, the speed of light. She didn't know, but surfing, which I grew up surfing. And that makes me really happy to think about. But just Jesus was having fun with this 16-year-old girl, which blows some people's minds. Like, well, that's God. But you don't know God. God created us with all our ability to enjoy and have pleasure. He created pleasure. He created the ability to ride waves or experience adventure and fun. And he shows the 16-year-old girl this incredible adventure. Well, as you know, then she passes into another realm, and Jesus brings her to God the Father on his throne, which I've come to realize talking to many, it's not a throne like we picture.
Right.
The throne is actually a place. It's the center of the universe, of universes, of all creation. It's the most glorious place ever. The closer you get, the more translucent they say everything becomes pure. And she finds herself on the Father's lap. She said, just like a little child with their mother or their father, just cuddled up and the most loving warmth you could ever imagine. And then unfortunately he said, you got to
You
go
gotta go
back.
back. Yeah. Well, let's backtrack to what is often earlier in that kind of transition journey. Our mutual friend Randy Kay, he talks about when he kind of comes out of the tunnel, people kind of end up in this kind of interim place, is the best way I can describe it. Where Randy describes seeing angels and demons kind of warring over him, is how he came to understand of it. Our friend Jim Woodford talks about a monstrous demonic like creature coming out of the pit trying to pull him into hell, and so people have a range of different experiences that often is kind of a contradiction of darkness, and then they call out to Jesus, they call it to God, and a lot of times light will come through, Jesus will show up, angels will show up. Talk to us a little bit about kind of that transition place, because I don't know that people always quite know what to do. They love the heaven side of the stories,
Yeah.
but when we get to some of this kind of scary stuff, people get really uncomfortable.
Well, of course, and we should.
It's a
Um,
warning almost,
it
really.
is, and I do think that's why God allows. In some cases, He allows Christians. So Jim, like another guy I interviewed, Ian,
Oh,
who,
Ian McCormick.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So he was a surfer in Mauritius when he got stung by 4 box jellyfish, and he was a pagan. I mean, he was just like, and he's dying on the way, and he basically God reminded him of his mother and
Her prayers for
her
him. Yeah.
prayers for him and to Jesus. And he was like, I don't know how to pray. Do I pray to what God do I pray to? There's so many gods. And so but he prays what his mother taught him about praying to Jesus, and
I think he actually he can like see, like visually
line
see
by
the Lord's
line, the
prayer.
Lord's
Right.
Prayer. Yeah.
Right.
And it was in that moment when he's later standing before this brilliant light, who he later discovers is Jesus. Um, he realizes that it was in that moment that he was saved. It was just that simple.
Hmm.
It's like the thief on the cross. One mocked Jesus, the other just said, "Remember me." But in his heart, he was acknowledging Jesus. That's all it takes, right?
Mhm.
And he was made right with God. Um, but I think God allows them sometimes in that last minute conversion to see a glimpse of hell before they cry out again, and he shows them heaven. And I think because he knows they're coming back and they're going to speak of the reality of both. So I think sometimes, that does happen. By the way, um, I know 3 pastors who had hellish experiences.
Were they already pastors when they had? No.
No,
Okay.
no, they were cocaine addicts, they were atheists, or they were college student alcoholics who were in complete rebellion against God. One, Paul Ojeda, had a cocaine overdose, and he said, "Suddenly I was sober,
Hmm.
and I was dropping through this darkness, just free falling to this darkness." And he said, I started thinking to myself, "Oh my gosh, I'm dead." I'm because he was awake. I mean, in his mind, and he said, "I'm a good person. I'm going to hell. I don't deserve this." And the more justification, the faster he went. And finally he goes, "Dear God, forgive me, save me." He just realized I can't. And he said at that point, the Lord appeared, not visibly, but he knew the Lord was there, and there was a peace, and the Lord said, "Paul, what have you done with the life I've given you?" Which is it's another common question
Right.
that Jesus asked. What have you done with the life I've given you? And it's not a question of judgment or condemnation. It's a question of, do you realize the gift of this life, and were you a steward of it? And then Paul gets a replay of his life, and God sends him back, and he becomes a pastor. Um, he didn't become a pastor. He started leading his relatives and his friends and their friends to faith, and it grew so big. He has the largest Hispanic church in Austin now.
Wow.
Same with Kyle. He was an alcoholic and died in that. And by the way, Kyle reminds me of something else. I think there are different levels of hell.
Sure.
Just like to some degree, I think there are different places in heaven
Yeah.
or the
Both are
heavenly realms.
expansive.
Expansive. And and I think what we do on this earth, you know, entrance into God's kingdom is a simple act of faith. That's
Right.
all it takes. Jesus, I want your forgiveness that you purchased on the cross. I want your leadership. That's all it takes. But what we do with this life, I think, does. And Jesus was very clear about the rewards of the life to come. It determines our responsibility, our faithfulness, and even our intimacy to some degree with the Lord. I like what one theologian said, that we will all be overflowing with the peace and joy and love of the Lord in heaven. But some will have a thimble size overflow and some will have a barrel size overflow. And we're determining the capacity of our ability to experience God's glory and light and love in heaven. And I've actually found that true in indie ears, because those who know and love God, when they're in his presence, they just drop they're just in awe, and
Right.
they're overflow. They're just
Right.
beyond themselves.
I feel like they're overwhelmed by the weightiness of the love, and just they can't they can't do anything but bow the knee and worship is the best way I could describe it.
And others who don't know him, they say things like, I never wanted to leave his presence.
Right.
I never wanted to. But they don't have the same sense of gravitas of awe and or the overwhelming experience. I think that, like a lawyer in Australia that I just recently interviewed told me, as he came into Jesus' presence, he sees this light and then these arms outstretched, and then suddenly he is just filled up with this. And he tried to describe it. He said, ecstasy.
Yeah.
And I asked him, so this is kind of risky, but I've had this thought for a long time. I said, if you had to compare it to anything on earth, what would you compare it to? And he said, I mean, it's beyond the greatest love of a parent for a child, or a child for a grandparent, or a lover for their beloved,
Sure.
spouses, their closest, sexual intimacy. All
Right.
of it is nothing.
Blows it away.
Nothing. And he said he was so overwhelmed that he said, I feel like I'm going to burst. And he hears the Lord chuckle, and it starts to subside. And then he says, no, I want more, not less. And he, so what, this is what I realized. What is coming? This life is a shadow of all
Right.
of it. And all the things that we think are so important to us in this life are nothing compared. They're all shadows of the real thing. I mean, when my granddaughter and I play with our shadows, where
Sure.
I'll get my shadow to chase her shadow, right? So my real body has to chase her real body, but we're watching our shadows, where our shadows are nothing.
Right.
They're only a reflection of the real thing that's us. And it's interesting, because even in the book of Hebrews, I think it's Hebrews 8, maybe 9, where it says that God instructed Moses to build the tabernacle exactly like the real one in heaven, for it's just a shadow of the real one. And to many degrees, I've come to realize that that's true. Like, our sun is artificial light,
Right.
and yet the sun of God is the brilliance and the glory of heaven. And the color spectrum we experience here, another commonality of indie ears is they say there were colors far beyond anything we could ever
we don't have
imagine.
words for the colors they see in heaven.
Well, if the light of heaven is the glory of God, the color spectrum of the light of God is going to be far beyond the color spectrum which makes up the colors of earth, of
Right.
the light of the sun. Here's another one that just blew me away. Jesus says, living water, right? Out of your innermost being will flow rivers of living water, of which he referred to the Holy Spirit, right? So in heaven, though, and this shocked me, as I was doing more and more research, more and more people who had entered the New Jerusalem had gone into the river, and there are many rivers, but they all come from the throne of God, and they're a source of the river of life that is of the Holy Spirit. And they go into this river, and they can breathe. And one said that, and I was like, what? And then I come across another that said that, and another one from the 1800s who had a near death experience goes into this water, and she said it was she could breathe. She wasn't wet when she came out, and it was like it cleansed her.
Mm.
Another fascinating thing is that um, they said to her, and they said to the angels would say to others, "This is for the healing of the scars of sin," which was confusing to me because I was like, "Well, what? We're not fully healed in heaven?" And then I read how the tree of life that grows by the river. So the nutrients of the river go up into the tree, and we eat the fruit of the tree of life, and its leaves are for the healing of the nations. So there's a continuation of this life into the life to come. And it's not just a, you know, life is over and now it's just, sit around and play patty cake. It's life. It continues, but it continues into a new realm in the way it was intended to be. But we still have responsibilities. We have enjoyment. We have parties. Jesus says there's going to be a great feast at my banquet table, and there's going to be a great marriage as well. How about this one? And this is such a God thing, right? He leads these people to me. So I'm meeting with an Iranian pastor who there was an Iranian family in my church, and he had led them to Christ on a bus in Tehran. And he came to visit them, asked to meet with me. He brings his mother who can't speak English. She just speaks Farsi. And in the conversation, I heard how he went from Hezbollah, a terrorist, and to coming to Jesus. And I asked, and then he said, "My mom is related to the Prophet Muhammad. She's like a big deal
Wow.
in Tehran." And I said, "Well, is she still Muslim?" And he said, "No." And I said, "How'd she come to Christ?" He said, "Well, I'll let her tell you." She starts telling me, and he's translating. Here's what she said. Now, again, they don't know me. They don't know I've studied thousand near death
Why are they
experiences.
telling you this story?
I'm in awe sitting there at lunch because she says, she when her son, so she's related to the Prophet Muhammad and built the mosque in their very well-to-do government gated community. So she was Muslim of Muslims. Like she was practically worshiped by other women and wore the full-on black,
Sure.
ninja hijab. And she has this near-death experience where she dies in her sleep, and she's there waiting for judgment because she expected the Prophet Abu to come and judge her. That's what she felt like because her children had become Christians, she had failed. So she was expecting condemnation. But instead, this man with a beard and a white robe glowing comes to her, and she feels this overwhelming peace, and he says, "I am he that I am." Or I am him. I mean, in Farsi. And then she comes back alive, and she is this incredible peace that she's never felt before. And of course, then bit by bit, she starts to realize who this is. Then she has another encounter actually, and she realized this is Jesus. And so she now helps start churches all across the Middle East.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, and I love hearing
I mean,
stories.
everything to lose. I mean,
Right.
that's the thing that if the listener
in that
isn't
culture,
realizing,
yes,
Jewish people seeing Jesus is not okay.
right.
Muslim people deciding they're going to follow Jesus, not okay.
That's a losing everything, if not losing your life scenario.
CEOs, business people, spine surgeons, commercial airline pilots, bank presidents saying they encountered heaven, and they get hated on in their career.
Right.
There's no good motivation.
Right. Right.
And yet it's happening. It's real.
I think the place I'd like to wrap up is just have you talk briefly. Why are we, why are people attracted to all these heaven encounters and near death experiences? Like there's an uptick in interest that is just,
Exponential.
Randy, me, we get thousands of emails, comments, people reaching out, talking about how these stories bless them, how they encounter the Lord through them. So there's definitely an uptick right now. It's been a normal part of your world for a long time, just with capturing all these stories. But why now? It just seems like God is being very intentional with how these stories are being able to brought to life and just shared with culture in a way we weren't even doing a few years ago.
Well, and Shaun, I don't know. I think that this is God's new global apologetic.
Amen.
In other words, and you see this, like for instance, when Israel is reborn in 1948, according to the prophetic utterances of Isaiah
Hmm.
years before, um, it's right during the Holocaust, right? And it's the same time when God gives us the Dead Sea Scrolls confirming the historicity of the Old Testament. I think there are times when the worst evil begins to gain a foothold when God gives more light. And I think about it. When else in our history could I be interviewing people all over the world without traveling,
Right. From the ease of your own office.
and we could be collecting stories that could go out to the whole world on their phones,
Right.
right? To show that the same God who created us all loves us all. And it doesn't matter what religious background you grew up in, he wants all to know what he's done for them through Jesus, because he wants us to know of his overwhelming love and forgiveness, and that his Holy Spirit will be with us and guide us. And I think that's what God is doing. And one other thing, more and more people that I'm interviewing, even those who are not necessarily, they don't know the Bible, and they would never say this, are saying God told them, I'm coming back soon.
Hmm.
And I've never been a I'm coming back soon. I honestly, I forgive me, Lord, but I've always been kind of like, yeah, you said that 2,000 years ago. And then they thought that 100 years after. And I would have thought, in World War II, but I mean, information is escalating. It's just exponential. And globally, these stories are exponential. I just heard of another one this week of a tribal African Muslim leader who had a near death experience like this and became a follower of Jesus. And so I'm looking forward to talking to him
Well,
in Africa.
wow. I love that. Well, and I would say from my perspective, this uptick is just it's related to the times that we're in.
Yeah,
I hadn't heard that people are starting to have Jesus tell them that he's coming back soon.
more and more.
Well, sadly, it is time for us to wrap up. We're at time for this episode. My prayer for this conversation is you've gotten a touch of heaven as we've shared these stories. And again, the book is Imagine Heaven. The author is John Burke. And we just appreciate you being with us for another episode of Engaging the Supernatural.